Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's Uncommon Sense live event. I'm Joshua Barnes, and I'm the founder of Process Mentors, and I'd like to welcome you all today to our discussion on what do Agile teams need to know. I'm joined by Al and Steve. Steve, if you want to, or Al.
Oh, to start off, yeah. So last week we talked about what it takes for a, although we should do introductions for people who aren't there. I'm sorry. So Steve, start with the intro, let it come around to me and I'll start.
Okay. Hello, friends of Herbie.
Right.
So we have to learn to tame the flow of this presentation. And we start with the introductions. I'm Steve Tendon. My thing is tame the flow, where I tame 4 flows. But maybe sometime we'll have some deeper conversations about that. And I'm also a fan of the theory of constraints. That's why I always refer to Herbie. And you should know who Herbie is. Oh.
Well, today I'm Herbie because I'm the constraint. So last week we started the conversation like what should a Scrum Master know or a team lead or whatever you want to call them. And my intention was kind of getting more specific knowledge that they should know. But instead we had a more general conversation about it. And I thought it was good. And if you hadn't listened to it, I would go back and listen to it. But I did want to get into some specifics. Like, I think a team lead should know how to do flow and do iterations. It's not always time boxing is appropriate. It's not always flow that's appropriate. There are different reasons, one more than the other. So today, who knows what we'll do, but I'm thinking that getting into more specific skills and understanding of what the team needs to know, and clearly the Scrum Master, team lead, whatever needs to be able to guide them to know that. So, and as a quick introduction, I'm the Director of Thought Leadership of Agile at Scale programs. Which doesn't mean I'm the thought leader. It means I kind of look ahead as the group and how can we move forward in the direction. And Joshua, why don't you start it off and introduce yourself and then get the thing kicked off and we'll see what happens.
Yeah. So hi, I'm Joshua Barnes, and what I'd like to kick it off with today, as far as what teams need to know, giving it some thought as we came into this session. My thing I want to start with is teams need to know that they have options. Right? They don't have one way that they should consider doing something, and they don't have one way that they should be coached or told to do something. Right? Again, my focus oftentimes is on disciplined agile, and that's a big part of it. Right? Is teams should be able to choose their way of working. So that's the first thing that teams need to know, and then I think we're going to have a follow-on discussion either next week or in a coming week on what does leadership and management need to know. Right? They need to know that teams need to be able to choose their way of working. So that's something that I think is important for the team members, important for, again, the team lead, the Scrum Master, the team level coach, and then anybody the team's interacting with.
So I think there are many important things that teams need to know, or even that teams think that they know, but that they should maybe reflect deeper on the sense of certain elements. One thing comes to mind for me, and that is autonomy. It's obvious for teams to be focused, productive, and be able to determine how to best resolve problems. They need autonomy. But autonomy does not mean anarchy, which often becomes the case. So one thing that teams need to know is how their work actually fits into the larger picture of the organization and where the organization wants to go, and also consider that a team by itself is just one element of a larger team, and that's where we can think in terms of the Boy Scout story of Herbie. We're all in it together. So that's, I always make the connection with Herbie.
Well, one thing that struck me as you were talking, Joshua, about, they need to know they have options, is what guides options. It's not just pick one of these. You have to know why to pick one of these. And to know why to pick one of these, you've got to know what the objective is. And so one of the things that a lot of Agile teams grow up on is the Scrum Guide. And in Scrum, they talk a lot about it's based on empiricism. And there's this claim that I actually say is not valid, that it's also based on lean thinking. And the reason I say that is they have put lean practices into Scrum, which is good. But lean thinking is a combination of empiricism and theory. And it's based on flow more than sprints. And there's no immutable anything in it. It's all about learning and seeing what works. But when I look at what's often taught, and not everybody teaches it this way. If you want to learn Scrum, find somebody who teaches the objective and the why of all the practices. And if you understand the objective, and if you understand the why, meaning the theory and the principle, for example, time boxing, the sprint is a time box, and there are reasons for that. The sprint has things be smaller because they got to fit in the sprint. That's part of the objective. And the why of that is when things are smaller, things get better. Tying back to Steve and TameFlow, basically, Ellie Goldratt, the creator of theory of constraints, once said, sometimes working on small items is all it takes to bring a system back into control. Small items are easier to work on. Not necessarily you release them. There are transaction costs, things of that nature. But I think what teams need to know is what are the objective of everything they're doing and what's the why of that objective. And I rarely, maybe rare is too strong a word, I don't very frequently, let me say it that way, I don't very frequently see that taught. And the justification is, well, we just have a few days, et cetera, et cetera. But I think it's very critical. And I think the why and the objective, then you could say, well, we can't abandon a practice without meeting the objective. And then we use the why to see which is best for our situation.
Yeah. So what are some of the other things they need to know? Well, I think they need to know where to start. And they need to know that wherever they're starting and the choices that they hopefully are able to make may not be the same choices they need to make tomorrow or next week, right? They're not locked into something that's not providing value. And the other thing is they need to know what good looks like and what they're doing, especially for teams, again, that are either new or moving towards an agile way of working, and either flow-based or iterative-based. Like, what does good look like? And what are some of the things that we should see that they understand as they're doing a potentially very different approach than that they had been. And I'll say back to your point, Steve, yeah, and then how their work is just one part of the value that's being delivered, hopefully, to the internal, external customer, and how they fit in. And, their project might be one of many disjointed projects that all have to come together, and they need to know that, or they should know it. And that's something that hopefully we're going to see in the coming future. As you talk about Move, we talk about MBIs.
Yeah, there is of course in that perspective I hinted at before, that a team is just one element of a larger arrangement, so a network of teams, typically in larger organizations. One key element is how a single team coordinates and synchronizes with others. Now, in traditional project-based work, you would do this with a PMO office, so you would apply classical project management. But when we come to knowledge work, software engineering, product development, and the like, the requirement of greater flexibility and agility means that what we said before, the element of autonomy, has to be pushed down to the teams so that they can coordinate and synchronize between themselves on their own accord. So you wouldn't need to have like the police guard, so to say, that shovels the cars in one direction or the other. But this creates a problem because all of the agile practices do not teach how teams can coordinate and synchronize. So there I see a huge mismatch, and there I think the good thing of DA with the pick your way of working is that you can add to typical agile practices maybe some other things that help in in doing these coordinations and synchronizations. For instance, of course, the buffer management techniques that derive from critical chain project management and which can be applied in these situations. So there are many things that teams can benefit from and that they are in need because of this autonomy element, but that they are not equipped to handle. So that's what we need to teach.
Yeah. Yeah, and I see John Ward's posted a few things in the comments, and one of the things that jogged my memory with John is he talked about or wrote about, I think, in his Agile line out, is the team learning parking lot. So how the teams identify some of the things that they want to learn together, potentially experiment with, and it could be just trying something out. It could be asking the coach to do a little bit of just-in-time training or some other way of learning being done by the team. But yeah, that's something else they need to know, how they're going to learn how to do things that are new.
You know, there's a tie in here that is a well, I think I got this from Don Reinertsen. Not sure it's his book or just I hear him talk a lot at conferences. But when he talks about, it's probably in his book too. I just don't remember. I do remember the conversations. He talks about the 777 being built, the Boeing 777. It was interesting, done in several ways. It was actually, I think, the first major aircraft that was built totally with a computer assist, CATIA, basically. Makes you wonder about how they could possibly have built a 747 just with drawings, and I mean, they had electronic tools, but wasn't a full CAD CAM system. But anyway, the thing about the 777 that was really interesting was management, director, leadership level made decisions about how much decision-making process people could do at lower levels. Like there was the higher up you are, the more money you can make. But what they did is it made it so you can make trade-offs. Weight and cost are very important things on a plane, because the less it weighs, then the cheaper it is to fly. It's worth more. But if you add weight to it, then you're actually making its runtime more expensive. So they made this trade-off of, if you can lower the cost but raise the weight, there were parameters. But I'm sorry, I'm kind of rambling. But the idea was this: you had across the organization, varying at the different levels, you had the context within which people at different levels could make decisions. So managers didn't have to micromanage everything. They said, look, these are guidelines. This is what you know. This is how you make your decisions. But as long as you make the decisions with these guidelines, we can trust you. And if you were a manager that wasn't used to this idea of trusting people, this idea of, okay, I'm the manager, but they're the workers. What this did is very important. It enabled managers to stay hands-off while they could trust the decision-making process. See, this whole thing about trust in the Agile space, okay, I'm going to say it this way. Don't take it out of context, okay? The whole thing about trust in the Agile space is misguided the way it's normally stated. Yes, we trust our people. Yes, we believe they have motivations. Yes, we don't want to micromanage them. But if they don't know how to make the decisions, trusting them to make good decisions is insane, because they're highly motivated, highly intelligent people who don't know how to do it. Like if you need a tracheotomy and I'm the only guy around you that can do it, I will do my best, but you're going to die. I mean, I don't know how to do it.
Or maybe there's a chance. Maybe
there's a chance. Let Al try the tracheotomy. But it's probably I wouldn't try because I'd get convicted of murder or manslaughter or something. Who knows? So there's the point I'm rambling and making is that as one way to decide what a team needs to know is ask yourself, if I've got a team that's autonomous, if I got a team that's able to figure out its own way of working, how would I know as an outsider, manager, consultant, director, whatever, how would I know as an outsider that they know how to get their job done? Or they have the vehicle to figure out when they don't, so they can figure out what it is. This idea of people will figure it out sounds great, but my experience of 20 plus years in the Agile space is people don't. And half the time they don't know they need to know something. So part of this, what do teams need to know, is twofold. One is, what are the things they need to know and how can they tell if they don't? And I'm just going to do a little segue and then be quiet for a few minutes. This is why I introduced the idea of the value stream and PDUs scorecard. You could tell if you were making things worse or not. And this is not dissimilar from the theory of constraints. Look for what's your constraint. Is what's slowing you down? Do you know how to do that? If you don't know how to do that, if all you're doing is following practices, then who knows? I don't think I trust the team. Yeah, they're motivated, they're nice, they're probably good looking, but they don't know how to tell if they're making good decisions. And if you don't have that, it's actually appropriate for management to be worried about it.
So Al, there is what you're saying is right, and there is let's say the other side of this coin, okay, which is subtle. It's very
That's
very
why I love
subtle.
talking with you, Steve, because you always show the other side of the coin that's subtle that I didn't get. So go ahead.
I'm always outside of the box. You know that by now.
I do.
Hey, you found the moment in this session, Steve.
Yeah, totally love it. Yeah.
Right, the outside of the box moment. So okay, let's see now. Where does this idea come from? Well, it has obviously a connection to the military. So mission command. Now the commander-in-chief expresses the objective, and then because you don't know what you will find on the ground, on the field, the operational units decide on their own, but they know where they need to go. So Al, you said something which is important. Now, how can you trust them if they are not able to make the decisions? And that's a key point. So we need to provide them with tools to make the right decisions. And in my perspective, those tools are what I call the mental models. But there is also another element. When von Moltke came up with the idea of mission command, the military exercise of the time were much simpler than what they are today, and we see this also in the business, in how companies are organized. Now, we had the industrial paradigm, and now in the knowledge work paradigm. The same happened in the military. What is the problem with the knowledge work paradigm? It's this, that in the old setting, the general could literally go on the field and show the youngster on the field how to maneuver their weapons and combat. So the commander knew how to do the thing, right? He knew. But in knowledge work, as Drucker teaches, the workers know. The guys at the top, they don't know.
Right.
So if this is like a reversal of where is the point of knowledge and where is the point that you don't know, and therefore in these situations of knowledge work, trust becomes a necessity, because if I don't know how to, I'm just making this up, how to code a bit of JavaScript or a bit of a SQL query, how can I trust that the people on the ground will make the right decisions? So that's where we need the mental models, where by means of these mental models, the people on the ground, with their knowledge, in respect to their context, will make decisions which are still consistent and coherent with the decisions that the management would do if they had the knowledge. So this, I think, is a very important and powerful concept. The mental models, you call them guardrails, I think once. They are sort of guardrails, but because they are mental, they are in the intellectual space, they are not fixed. And that's where you give the autonomy. The people can make decisions on their own, but they are guided by this interpretation of the world that comes from the mental models. And then they say, okay, with my knowledge, I go in that direction. And it just so happens that at the top, that was the direction they wanted to go, even if they didn't know. Maybe I've been confusing things beyond what I normally do, but I hope you got it.
Yeah, no, I did. In fact, I think it actually illustrates a two-way street. I'm actually going to put in the chat a picture what we used to call guardrails. This, I don't know why, but this is when I copy and paste a URL, the whatever this thing's called, stream or whatever, it's changing it to just being the domain. So let me shorten it. That seems to work. Here's a in the chat, I'm putting something that's got a picture that we used to call guardrails, and when we moved in net objectives, when we moved it to disciplined agile, they're now the middle one, the promises. So they're principles, promises, and guidelines. And the promises are like create psychological safety and embrace diversity, accelerate value realization, collaborate proactively. The reason, I'm not going to go through the rest, you can look at that link and see it. But the reason we called them guardrails was as long as you stayed within that, like as long as I knew I was accelerating value realization, I could do things. And by the way, if I didn't know I was accelerating value realization, it meant I don't have all the information I need because I promised I would do that. If you don't know what that means, then you're not keeping your promise. So this boundary is a good thing. But what I wanted to mention when you said what you were saying is there's this two-way street with management. The manager is looking to see, not micromanage it. Like we talk about in Lean, walk the Gemba. You know, you go down to the Gemba where the work takes place. And that's a two-way street there. First, they get to see how people are working. But in the process of doing that, they get to see what the challenges are that people have. And then they have one of two choices. They could say, oh, the environment's messed up. I got to help them. That's my job, improve the environment so they can get their job done. But the other thing is they could observe that something is wrong with how they're working. So it's not micromanage now, it's educate. See, and in my mind, the Scrum Master role missed this because, to be candid, I think Ken Schwaber hates management. And we didn't know how to make a manager in the American culture. So we just said, well, let's not have one, let's have a Scrum Master. But the manager in a lean system plays two streets here, two ways. And then you get it by walking the Gemba, by observing. One is you look to see how are they doing? What are the challenges? How can I help them with their challenges? And the second thing is what do they not know to get their job done? And then I could do things like katas and stuff like that to teach them on how to learn. And as a Scrum Master, that's what you should be doing. It's not this passive role. It's this dual active role that's there. By the way, I'd be interested in people's thoughts on that. I'm watching the chat, whether you agree, disagree, or whatever.
Al, I was going to loop back into what you said about the 777. Yep, there was a message. It was the first digitally designed aircraft by Boeing, and then the V-22 was the first helicopter. And so one of the things I think is also important that we've talked on before in some of these sessions is people have to start with where they're at, and they don't have to jump in wholeheartedly again into a framework or something that is going to abandon some of the things that work for them. So I'll say within at least, I think it was the past decade, Adrian Newey, who was one of the best aerodynamicists in Formula One and built some of the most championship winning cars, designed the cars on paper when all the other teams had already moved to everything being designed digitally, still winning championships. I mean, at some point it had to be brought into a digital medium, but they didn't abandon some of the things that worked and made them a very high performing team. So that's just something else that I think is important that teams need to realize is that things that have worked for them and things contributing to the value that they're producing as part of the overall value that's going to be produced, they don't have to just throw it out.
That's right. Steve, I'll let you go. Otherwise, I've got two comments.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think there might be a question here, Steve, because I see the name Herbie in it. So,
we'll see. That's 3. Okay, Srinivas. What is the crucial steps teams need to know to design the flow of work at the team level, from the team flow and TOC? To design the flow of work as well, thinking required to see the Herbie in to manage the flow and the project. I think I understand the question. And okay, it's referring to some specific things of team flow. But if we, and of course, most people don't know team flow, so I would maybe reflect on the sense of this question with respect to, let's say, a Kanban board, which is much more commonly known. And in a Kanban board, we know there is this practice, which I abhor. It's the practice of the column WIP limits. And there you have what the team needs to know. They need to know how to set these limits. Now, whether it's a good or a bad practice, that's not the point. I will say it's a bad practice, but it's not the point. The point is that if you decide to do something like that, well, it's not sufficient to say, oh, put on the WIP limits. You must teach the team, no, how do you put on the WIP limits? What are the policies, the strategies to decide what is a good limit? When do you change the limit? What consequences do you have when you change that limit? How are all these things impacting other teams that might come further downstream? Now, especially if you are in a large organization, as we said before, we have networks of teams, and it's inevitable that you need that coordination, synchronization. But if all of a sudden you start changing the WIP limits on your Kanban board, and that affects the flow of your team, of course, it has a ripple effect on anything that's further downstream. So that's the kind of knowledge that teams need to have, and it's not knowledge that has to be like imparted or demanded from above, because that would again go against the idea of the autonomy. But Al, you said something before that I really feel compelled to comment. And maybe here's the moment I go off the tangent.
I'm ready.
Is it on the daily stand-up or the daily coordination meeting?
Yeah, absolutely. It's about the stand-up.
I'm not.
About that.
I'm sorry. Say that again. Sorry, Steve. What did you say?
Well, it's about the stand-up. Actually, some of the Scrum practice, because before you said that Ken Schwaber is like against management, and I think that's part of the Scrum culture. It has become part of Scrum.
It has become part of the Scrum
anti-management sentiment. And as you know, I was part of Borland, where the stand-up meeting, the product owner and the Scrum master were like taken from in Scrum. This is Jeff Sutherland that has stated that, and it was taken via the works of Jim Coplin when he was working for AT&T. And the Scrum master in Scrum became like the defender of the team, defender from the nasty managers,
protector of the team. Yeah.
That became part of this culture, but the original Scrum Master, which was not called a Scrum Master, had another name, was not a defender of the team. He was an ambassador for the managers when they could not be present. So it's a total reversal of the role. And because managers are so busy, they are seldom present, and therefore this ambassador role, this diplomatic role, was absolutely essential. If you have a large organization, well, top management needs to give that sense of direction, and then through that, what we said before, delegation and mental models, autonomy, and so on. But the lines of communication need to be short. The feedback loops need to be quick and fast, and that's where this role came about. Where in Borland was Philip Kahn. He was all over the place because he was hyperactive, but he couldn't be at all places all the time. So when he was not present, there was someone who was representing him at the team level. So not defending the team at all, but having that sense of broader, greater team. We're all in it together, and if the top guy cannot be there, someone will represent and bring back whatever things need to be brought back, whether that is information or also, and this is another point, maybe you will comment on this. No, the escalations. No, if something goes bad, how many times do managers discover that like 3 days before the deadline when they have the trade show? Couldn't you have told me this like 3 months ago when the problem started to appear? So the culture of immediate escalation, when you cannot face the problem on your own, is another thing that teams need to pick up. So anyway, I'm just going on. I have to let Joshua talk as well.
Well, one of the other things that I think is important is, for teams to understand and know what level of support that they've got, right? And what level of support they should have. Like, how much of this should they just figure out on their own? How much are they expected to? Who should be there helping? Do they have a coach, available? Do they have somebody that is a little more knowledgeable? That's something that oftentimes in practice, teams don't understand, and they don't really know what they should have, let alone sometimes maybe what they do and what they should.
Well, I've been taking notes, so I got 3 things here because they all tie together. Actually, that last one you said, Steve, about, well, shouldn't I have known 3 months instead of 3 days? That's actually happens. And people say, well, yeah, but that happens because managers will react and it's bad and all that. And I'm saying, well, wait a minute, it's still a symptom. The way most agile teams work, there's not real visibility of what's happening because you don't have explicit workflow. You might have visibility of where things are, but if you don't know how people are working, you can't really tell what's going to happen. This is actually the biggest difference. At least it was 12 years ago. After the Lean Kanban conference in Miami in 2009, just before the Agile conference, I think for whatever reason, Kanban was making a presence, and some Scrum thought leaders thought they needed to attack Kanban, like, well, this isn't a good thing. And one of the things that was brought out was the explicit workflow idea in Kanban, creating visibility. And it was like, oh, this is bad. People will now start following this and doing this, and we'll start doing things by rote. And it was a real misunderstanding of it. Like, people talk about following Kanban board. Should I do what's on the Kanban board? And the answer is no. The Kanban board is merely a reflection of the best way you know how to do your work. It's a description, a reflection again of what people have decided. This visibility is very important. And this is something that if you have the visibility, a good manager can say, hey, they're having problems here. See, this is part of the whole idea of, we took something that was inspired by one thing from one culture and then moved it into another culture without considering it. Now, the reason I say this, in the new product development game, a lot of what was taken from there was studying Japanese companies. That wasn't all Japanese companies. But if you look at Lean and the ideas of Lean, Lean had this notion, or Toyota had this notion of the chief engineer, somebody that was essentially a manager and a product owner integrated together. They owned everything. Like, oh, I'm going to build a SUV, or whatever they called it back in the 70s for Toyota. And I own both the way I manage the team and I own what we're building, the product we're building. Now, nothing like that exists in the United States culture. And it's starting to happen now. So part of the issue is we have to recognize, let's not hold on to something that happened 20 years ago when we moved from one culture to the next. But what we have to also recognize is Scrum is very centric about the team. We need to look back for the whole value. This whole conflict between product owner and Scrum Master is a complete fabrication of, we don't understand it's all about value to the customer. These two people are working on the same team. Scrum Master and product owner, there's no conflict there unless you're looking at it at a micro level. Both should be looking at, how do I get the most value? So the product owner needs to understand overloading the team is not a good idea. And the Scrum Master needs to know, well, what gives us most value? But there's no theory to guide the roles, so they don't understand it. They just look at the practices, and that causes conflict. So this lack of theory, again, keeps showing up as a big problem for me in Scrum, because all these symptoms that people talk about can get traced back to, they don't understand the why, they don't understand the objective. Now, one last comment, and I'll shut up for a while. So I don't know if you meant this or not, Joshua. If you meant it, I'll disagree, but I don't think it's what you meant. When you said we have to start where you are, see, I think that was a shortcut. You have to first see where you are.
Sure.
But when you see, I totally agree, you have to see where you are. But when you see where you are, one of the things may be, given this is where we are, we're going to make a quick jump over there because we're able to make a quick jump. And sometimes companies are ready to make a jump earlier. And I know this is kind of what I think you meant. So the change our way of working may be a big jump. This is the one complaint. Well, I don't know the one complaint. This is a complaint I have about the Kanban method of saying you start where you are. You start where you are. No, you don't start where you are. You look where you are. You make the decision of what you're going to do based on where you are. And because we're doing a transformation, we've got budget, we might do a jump right away. The team, the company may be ready to do an immediate jump, and we'll take advantage of that attitude based on where we are and what our culture is. And that's how we choose our way of working. So I just want to be explicit.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and what I meant was we can start where we can look, to your point, where we are, and we can start there if that's what's going to make the most sense. Because if we're going to make a big jump and we can't do it for a whole lot of reasons, we're not potentially going to be any better off. We could be worse off. So one of the other thing, and I see there's a comment, Al, you're probably replying to. It looks like John put something
I'm not sure what John means. So Scrum is product centric. Can you just throw things in there, John? And I'll see. So, John is another one of these people. He's always apologizing for telling me things he thinks I don't want to hear because he's disagreeing with me a lot of the time. But he's almost always right. He's like another one of these out of the box thinkers. Hey, John, no thanks. Big help to have that. So I appreciate it. So tell me where I'm wrong here. I'll read it and we'll resolve it.
So Al, when you started the discussion off today, one of the things that you kind of, I think, threw out there was, taking either an iterative approach or taking a flow approach. And so that's one of the things that I guess we could look back on our own experience, or everybody who's watching this either live or recorded. When you first took the step to move into what would be an agile way of working, was it one approach? Was it just an iterative approach because Scrum is so prevalent? And should you have known, or would you have benefited at least having some amount of awareness that, yep, there are other ways, and there are other ways that might be better for you, might be better for the next quantity of work we're doing, might be better for Steve, as you tied back into all of the work that's contributing, activities to delivering that value, and how it's all going to come together. That's one. Of the things.
I remember this really well because there were a whole bunch of us in 99 and 2000 who could not explain what Agile was. We didn't have the name for it. And I remember struggling with it, and I called it IQ. I called it integrated, iterative, and incremental. Or I think I actually said incremental. We're building increments, we're iterating over them, and then it's integrated, it's everything. And that's kind of what I called it. It's a tech geek name. It's bad name. But nobody that I could think of at the time ever talked about flow as an option until, I don't know, around 2007, when Anderson started talking about Kanban. And maybe a little bit before that, but from 2000 up until 2005, 2006, no. And in the background, anything that was said about Agile was in the context of it being a time box. Now, the goal had told us it could be different. So I'm not saying the thought wasn't out there, but in the Agile space, the thought wasn't present at all. It was just not present. And I like what Ed Schein says. He says, we don't see what we talk about. We can only talk about what we see. And if all we saw was increment, we did not see this other option. And once I saw this idea of Kanban and small pieces, even though I'd been doing lean for a long time, I was thinking of lean from a different way, not from a flow model as much as I do now. Back then, it was more management, creating better environments, systems thinking. To me, lean at the beginning was systems thinking, removing delays just in time, focus on quality, which I'd already been doing, AT&T, test-driven development, stuff like that. So to me, the stop the line was the attitude that when you find an error, because your system's thinking and it's the system causing it, you just stop it. The idea was stopping the line, taking that attitude was better. But none of that had anything to do with iteration or flow. It was just shut down delays, smaller. We were big proponents. Net Objectives was one of the first people who were talking about 1 week sprints. People would complain 2 weeks were too short. We'd say, yeah, you need to go to 1 week. They would look at us crazy. And then we'd explain why actually, if you're having troubles with 2 weeks, 1 week really brings out the issues. You go faster. So yeah, that was a big thing. And I think even now, what you see in the Scrum Guide 2020, which I actually really dislike, just to be, people ask me, have I read it? Yeah, I've read it 5 times. And every time, I think I've stopped reading it now because every time I read it, it just makes me feel worse. But the reason is by trying to make it more abstract so it fits more places, and by incorporating lean practices into it, which is not lean thinking. They've taken the Scrum model of time boxing, put lean practices in it. It's not consistent with lean thinking. What you've got is this time boxing with flow inside it. And that's confused the issue of what flow is. Flow does not need time boxing. I mean, that's the whole idea. You don't do time boxing. You might have a vision of where you're headed, which you need. That's where we use minimum business increments for. Minimum business increments, the chunk of value we're delivering creates us the vision. But we do it on a flow basis. So I think we have, personally, I don't see a lot of difference between nowadays mindset of Scrum and where it was in the 2003 to 2005. People are saying, oh, the Scrum Guide's changing. We're doing all this. The underlying foundation of being based totally on empiricism, of being incrementally based, of having an immutable core that you can't change. That hasn't changed in 25 years. And that's what drives the stuff.
Let's pull up what John put something in there.
Yeah, I'm looking at what John says. Yeah, you were the one who turned me on to Ed, I think, John.
So while Al's kind of reading that, Steve, I'll ask, when was the first time you started to look at flow, since Al kind of described when he did?
I discovered flow through TOC, and I discovered TOC through David Anderson's first software engineering management book, I think it was called, where he had the ambition to apply TOC to knowledge work. But then that did not work out, and Kanban was the solution, and that disturbed me very much, because with Kanban you're losing Herbie. No, Herbie was lost, and I was desperate, and I always want to have a Herbie, because Herbie is the catalyst. It gives you a single point of focus. So anyway, in I think it was 2003, I read that book, and then I just started devouring everything about TOC, and TOC has very strong concepts of flow. The flow is the basis of TOC, so that's where the ideas of operational flow and informational flow came about in TameFlow. Then the part of informational flow, even though I did not have a name for it, comes directly from the organizational design patterns, which are the foundation of TameFlow, which was the pioneering work of Jim Coplin. And then my fourth flow is psychological flow. So a state of optimal individual and team performance. Now all of these things and all of these flows are just absent from Agile. Yes, there are some elements. You see people starting to talk about psychological safety. That's one tiny element of the much broader notion of psychological flow. So it has been an evolving journey, and I think because I've been exploring flow under so many different perspectives and from different directions, it's just been adding and adding and adding. So even if I talk about 4 flows, at the end it's their concerted action that moves value through the company. So what I'm concerned about is the flow of value. That's the main thing.
Let's see. Could you not see Scrum time boxes just be an approach to limit WIP small batches?
Well, it does. There's no doubt. That's one of the objectives of time boxing, is to limit WIP, because you've got smaller batches. But I wouldn't call them small batches. A 2-week sprint is 2 weeks of work. Small batch to me is 1, 2, 3 days worth of work. So years ago, I actually stated that Scrum was a partial implementation of Lean. And if you thought about it that way, you could see how to improve it. And basically, I got thrown off the Scrum development group for that because he was like, oh, Al's selling Lean. And no, I wasn't selling Lean. I was trying to, I didn't own Lean. I mean, Mary and Tom Bobidick at the time were the #1 there. But so, yeah, so what we want to do is be clear that the purpose of time boxing is smaller pieces, clarity of what we're trying to accomplish, limiting WIP. And this is why another alternative would be use flow, use minimum business increments so you have the vision, and understand that small pieces are what's important. But what happens is, because people don't understand those objectives and they don't understand the why, they'll have troubles with sprints. And they'll say, oh, sprints are working against us. We have all this impediment. And they'll abandon the sprint because they just say, well, we can't do it. This is the danger of not having the explicit objective. So what a lot of people think they're doing Kanban. They're not doing Kanban. They're doing Scrum without sprints. That's not Kanban. But you can't blame them. And then people say, well, they're not doing Scrum, so it's not our fault that they're not doing Scrum. And I say, yeah, it is, because you didn't define Scrum to explain what the objective of the practices are. So people look at the problem, they get frustrated, they can't figure it out, and they abandon it. To me, that's poor design.
So that question about the time boxes as an element of limiting work in process, well, that's obviously true. And whether you use time box or Kanban column WIP limits, the effect is the same. You limit the work in process. And usually when you limit work in process, things flow better. So the performance improves. But from my perspective, both time boxes and column WIP limits are very much anti-flow. Why? Because it's all about start and go. The time box, every 2 weeks or whatever your iteration length is, you stop and reconvene, and then you restart. The column WIP limits, I made the comparison. It's like going on the Autobahn in Germany with expectation to drive at 200 kilometers per hour, but you have a toll booth every 500 meters. You can't even get out of first gear, and then you have to stop again. So it does limit WIP, but it also limits performance. So that's why you need some other method to really enable the flow of value, and it has to be paced on the capacity of, guess who? Herbie with drum buffer rope. So yeah, you should never overload the system more than what Herbie can manage and deal with.
But Steve, you're about hyper performing teams. Going from one toll booth to the next, you would have like a Model S Plaid where you could 200 kilometers, 300 kilometers an hour.
There are no limits.
Yeah, it's not that sprints or time boxing doesn't have a place, but you have to understand the cost. And the place is, it creates this idea of stepping points and a cadence. And some people need that kind of concreteness, but not everybody. Scrum is not always the place to start. Sometimes sprints are useful. This is one of the choose your way of working. Hey, how should we work? Do we want to create like little mini working places that we get done in a week or done in 2 weeks? Or do we want to say, look, here's the product owner. They're deciding what to do. We're going to take the most important thing, get it done, then get the next most important thing and get it done, get the next most important thing and get it done. And that's a conversation you need to have. So but for years, it was like, no, iterations, increments, that's the way to go. And I disagree with that.
Yeah. One thing so I agree as well that, it should be just based on whatever's going to be the best fit. But you did say one thing I do want to comment on. So when you said 2 week time boxes, I can't remember if you said a sprint or an iteration. That's a long time, and it, versus a day or two. Because I think you've said things like that before, but you're assuming that nothing gets done until the 2 week mark, right?
No, but I know that. I'm not assuming that. No, I'm not assuming that.
Okay. It sounds like
here's what happens. No, I'm not assuming that. I know. Well, first of all, 2 bad things can happen. One is people can have 1 week stories which is too
Yeah,
big.
right.
5-7 day sprints. That's one thing, but that's not even my biggest thing because it's easy to change that. But look, let's be honest here or candid. Okay. A lot of people are in software development because they don't want to talk to other people and they can go off and work by themselves. I was like that. I got into mathematics. I was in super theoretical mathematics because I can go into my office and I didn't have to talk to anybody. And it's an ideal world and it was wonderful. And it worked until I got a job. And then it was like, crap, you know, this doesn't work in the real world. So, and I've shifted quite a bit, as you can tell. But what happens is you get this, I go off and work and then I have to come in and daily tell people where I'm at. And look at most daily stand-ups. It's like da-da-da-da-da, nothing happens, no real information because people want to go back to work. They say it's all a waste of time. So what happens when you have sprints is you tend to not break things down into really small pieces. And people are like, well, I'm not going to have these long meetings all the time. You don't have to do that. When I work on teams, I'm building something right now, value stream management, microcred, as we call it. And we've got a team of 4 or 5 people. And we don't have daily stand-ups, but we have daily touch points. See, I just want to know, do they have enough work? Do they have a question? I guess you could put it in the daily stand-up, but we don't go around the room. Sometimes these are 5 minutes. Sometimes they're a half an hour. But we talk as often as we can. We use Teams so anybody can ping anybody at any time. We're trying to have very, very short feedback loops. And when you have a 2-week cadence, the feedback loop tends to be 2 weeks. I want to have 2-hour feedback loops. I want it to be continuous. And the other thing is, if you've got a 2-week cadence, you tend to fill, what is it, Parkinson's law? What is it, that work fills the time allotted? Well, I don't want that. I want a sense of urgency and alacrity on everything I do. Day by day, I want that. I don't want to be freaked out like it's urgent, but I want to see, what am I going to get done today? Not what am I going to get done over the next 2 weeks, because at the beginning of the sprint, it's, oh, I got 2 weeks. Hey, I can relax.
So, you know? There is another very subtle negative consequences of time boxing, which most people are just not aware of. And it derives from the fact that, at least in TameFlow, I'm extremely data driven. So we use a lot of flow metrics. And if you try to use flow metrics with a sprint, and in addition to the flow metrics, you use like the signaling system that I have with the buffers. The problem is that with that stop and go, you are resetting the level of signal that is inside all the noise. So if you want to have a signal-driven system where you can react on leading signals of how the work is flowing, or the flow is slowing down, or it's about to have a crash, if you are sprinting, you don't have the signals. You're wiping them out because at every stop, you start over again. So that using sprints prevents a data-driven approach to managing the flow. And if you don't have data, I think, as Deming said, no, you don't know what you're talking about.
Well, I'm going to take that a step further. I was very impressed with this book called Lean Strategy by Michael Ballet. And I've been doing Lean. I learned actually a little bit about Lean in the mid-'80s, or Toyota's work anyway. And when I read Lean Strategies, I really understood Lean is about education. Lean is about learning. It's not a surprise that Toyota Kata came from basically Lean and Toyota. When you think about it, if you're waiting 2 weeks to learn, well, first of all, you're exhausted at the end, whether you're successful or not. So you're ready. Like, the last thing I want to do if it was unsuccessful is to rehash the misery I just went through. And if I celebrate it, I don't have to, because we just did a good job. But even if I did it, I've got to look at what happened over the last 2 weeks. What happens with flow, something happens. You're talking about data. I'm just talking about the experience. I mean, I agree with what you said, but it's also, I just did something and it messed up. Well, now's the time to learn from it. So the idea of micro retros, and I mean micro, like 15, hey guys, we just messed this up. What could we have done different? How did it happen? Or like John Ward in his, sorry, I forgot the name, Scrum line out. Talks about if you're gonna have a retro, do it in the middle of the sprint, so you can improve yeah, so oh my God, two sprints, two retros. No. Do what's appropriate. Do what you can learn. Do shorter ones so they can make a difference, not so you can rehash it at the end.
Yeah.
So
But
yeah, I agree. I think the cadence of learning should be on the bit level, not the 2-week level.
well,
it should be on the now when there is reason. So I also have
Yes.
this concept of like the ad hoc, stand-up meeting or micro retrospective. So basically, it's a swarming event where the team gathers. Why? Because there is a problem. So this is one thing that teams need to learn, that when there is a problem, you don't wait until the next, bell so you just call the meeting there and then. And if you are really into getting things to flow, then the other counterpart is let people work. Don't keep on getting them into unnecessary meetings. And you can only get to call the meetings in two ways. One is the data-driven approach, and together with that, it's not an alternative. Together with that, you have to create this. How can we say? Develop the situational awareness of the team, so that when they detect that something is wrong, the issue is raised there and then. Now, if you have a very bad situation, you will have these alarm bells going off maybe every hour, because you are in a desperate situation. But then that is what should happen. If you are in a desperate situation, you just have to put your head down and confront the problems as you discover them. But on the other hand, if you are in a well-working situation, you could also avoid having any sort of meetings for days and days, because you know the whole thing is flowing. You don't want to interrupt flow unless it's necessary. So I think
meetings are a symptom of lack of continuous communication and learning.
Yeah, agree.
And I realize we're running out of time. So
yeah, and I know. Let's see. We talked about having another one of these on what leadership and management.
I think that would be good.
I think that'd be good. Claudia had put something out on LinkedIn, which, Steve, I saw you chimed in on that. We do something that's kind of like an MBI and Team Flow move with respect to non-software development at all. So I think that also would be a really great topic. If there's any other thoughts, let me see if there were any other questions or anything else on here. Oh yeah, and since Al, you'd mentioned that Tom was on here, maybe we can get Tom to join us in one of these sessions as well.
Oh yeah, that'd be awesome, Tom. You want to come any Thursday, 12 o'clock our time? Have you come on board? That would be awesome.
Yeah, and I guess on that note, I'll say, fantastic session. Thanks for everybody who's been watching and commenting.
Yes,
Al,
and remember, never leave Herbie alone in the woods.
That's right. And Jerry, that's right. Actually, I'm not claiming I did that before Agile, but a lot of people were doing it. But having the labels and the names make it so other people can pick it up better. So till next week, thanks for being here.
Yep. Till next week. Thanks.